I watched a king die from a wound no bigger than my thumb. My name is William of Nottingham, and I have grown old in the years since Châlus. My hands shake when I draw the bow I once pulled with certainty. Some memories remain sharp as the edge of a Saxon blade, sharper perhaps, because they cut deeper than any steel. I was there when Richard Lionheart fell. I saw the bolt fly. I watched the greatest warrior in Christendom brought low by a crossbowman with a frying pan for a shield. 20 years have passed, yet I see it still, as clear as the spring water in the brook behind my cottage. I see Richard in the twilight, magnificent and careless. I see the lone figure on the battlements. I see everything slow, like honey dripping from a spoon, and then the wet sound of iron punching through flesh. I have tried to understand it, why God would allow such a man to die in such a place for such a reason. A petty castle, a dispute over treasure that may not have even existed. 10 days of agony ending in darkness. I can only tell what I saw, what I knew, what I felt in those terrible days of March and April in the year of our Lord 1199. I had served Richard for 7 years by then. I was no knight, no nobleman, just an archer from Nottingham, one of hundreds who followed the Lionheart across the seas and back again. I had been with him in Normandy, fighting Philip of France in endless grinding campaigns. Richard was 41 years old that spring, and to us, he seemed eternal. We had seen him at Acre, leading charges that should have killed any mortal man. We had watched him survive shipwreck, imprisonment, betrayal. The summons came in late February. We were quartered near Chinon when word arrived of a treasure discovered at Châlus-Chabrol, a nothing little castle in the Limousin. The stories varied in the telling, as stories always do around a campfire. Some said a peasant had turned up a golden statue while ploughing his field, a Roman emperor cast in solid gold. Others claimed it was a hoard of ancient coins, enough to fill a wagon. Still others whispered of something stranger, artifacts of the old empire, jewelry fit for Caesar himself. I never learnt the truth of what was found, if anything was found at all, but treasure has a way of making men stupid, and Aymar of Limoges, the viscount who held that land, had refused to surrender it to Richard. Everything found on a lord's land belonged to that lord, and Richard was Aymar's liege. The law was clear, but Aymar was in rebellion, allied with Philip of France in that endless chess game of betrayal and counter-betrayal that was Aquitaine. Perhaps there was treasure. Perhaps it was just an excuse. In the end, it hardly mattered. We marched in early March, and I remember the weather turning. Winter had been hard that year, but spring came early. Too early, some of the older men muttered, as if the seasons themselves were out of joint. The roads were rivers of mud churned by the hooves of destriers and the boots of men-at-arms. We were not a large force. Richard had brought perhaps 40 knights, 100 men-at-arms and 200 archers and crossbowmen. No great siege train, no massive trebuchets, just mining equipment and ladders. This was to be quick work. The castle at Châlus-Chabrol held maybe 40 defenders, perhaps fewer. Richard treated the entire affair as an amusement, a brief distraction before returning to the real war against Philip. I remember the first time I saw the castle. We crested a low hill on the 25th of March, and there it sat, a single stone tower rising from a modest curtain wall, perched on a rocky outcrop above a half-dried stream bed. Wooden palisades filled the gaps between stone. A ditch, maybe 8 feet deep, ringed the base. I had seen stronger fortifications protecting granaries. The village of Châlus itself was already abandoned, the peasants having fled into the countryside or taken refuge in the castle. Smoke rose from a few buildings the advanced scouts had fired. Spring birds sang in the trees as if mocking the idea that this place was worth an army's attention. Richard rode at the head of the column on his grey destrier, his red surcoat bright against the pale sky. He looked at the castle and laughed. I heard it clearly, that booming laugh of his. He turned in his saddle and called back to Mercidier, his captain of mercenaries. 3 days I give them, less if they have any sense. Mercidier, dark and grim as a hanged man, nodded without smiling. He never smiled, but I saw him study the walls with the eye of a man who had taken 100 castles and knew that even the smallest could kill you if you were careless. We made camp that afternoon in the field south of the castle, just beyond Crossbow range. The routine was familiar. I had done it so many times I could set my tent and dig my fire pit without thinking. The smell of wood smoke began to drift across the camp as cooking fires were kindled. Men laughed and joked, already counting the plunder. The siege would be simple. We would mine under the walls while keeping the defenders pinned down with arrow fire. When the tunnel was ready, we would collapse it, bringing down a section of wall and storm through the breach. A week, perhaps 2. Easy money. That first evening, I stood my watch on the northern edge of camp, bow in hand, watching the castle in the fading light. The sun was setting behind us, painting the stone tower gold and red. On the battlements, I could see figures moving, the defenders looking down at the army that had come to kill them. I wondered what they were thinking. Did they hope for relief? Did they think Aymar would send help? Or did they know, as I knew, that they were already dead men, and the only question was how many days they had left? A crossbow bolt hissed out from the walls and fell short, thudding into the mud 50 paces away. A desultory gesture of defiance. I did not bother to shoot back. Save your arrows for when it matters, my old captain used to say. The siege had not truly begun. The next day, the 26th of March, the mining began in earnest. Teams of men with picks and shovels started digging at the base of the outcrop, working to tunnel under the foundations of the eastern wall. It was brutal work. The rock was hard, and the defenders dropped stones and boiling water on anyone who came too close. We archers kept up a steady rain of arrows, forcing the men on the walls to keep their heads down. I shot until my fingers bled, the bowstring biting into the calluses I had built over years. The rhythm of it was almost soothing. Knock, draw, loose, knock, draw, loose. The arrows arced up and over, black lines against the blue sky, falling among the defenders like deadly rain. Richard was everywhere that day. He rode along the siege lines, shouting encouragement, joking with the men, even taking a turn with a pick at the tunnel face. He had always been that way, a king who fought beside his soldiers, who shared their dangers and their hardships. It was why men loved him, why we would have followed him into hell itself if he had asked. But it also made him reckless. He took risks no king should take. We all knew it, but who would dare tell the Lionheart to be careful? The day wore on. The sun climbed and then began its descent. The light turned golden, then amber. The shadows grew long. I was standing near the horse lines, checking my bowstring and counting my remaining arrows, when I heard the commotion. Men were shouting, pointing toward the castle walls. I looked up and saw Richard riding out from camp, heading toward the siege lines with only a handful of knights. He wore no mail, just his padded gambeson, the quilted coat we wore under armor. He carried a shield, the rectangular kite shield we called a scutum, but nothing else. No helmet, no hauberk. He was inspecting the day's progress, making his evening rounds as casually as a man surveying his own lands. I felt something cold touch my spine. It was too casual, too careless. The defenders were still shooting from the walls. I could see the flash of crossbows in the dying light. But Richard seemed unconcerned, even amused. He was talking with one of his knights, gesturing toward the mining operation. I started walking toward the siege lines, though I could not have said why. Perhaps some instinct, some soldier's sense that something was wrong. That was when I saw the figure on the battlements, a lone man standing atop the tower, clearly visible against the darkening sky. He was doing something strange, holding what looked like a frying pan in one hand, using it to deflect the arrows still falling around him. It was absurd, almost comical. A frying pan for a shield. The man was either mad or possessed of extraordinary courage. I heard Richard laugh again, that same booming laugh. He had seen the man too. He was pointing at him, showing his knights. Perhaps he admired the man's audacity. Perhaps he thought it was a joke. I never asked. The man on the wall raised his other hand. He held a crossbow, the heavy war crossbow we called an arbalest. The light was fading fast now, that brief moment between day and night when the world seems to hold its breath. I see it still, frozen like a painting. Richard sitting tall on his destrier, shield held low, head turned toward his companion. The crossbowman on the wall, silhouetted against the purple sky, the frying pan glinting dully, the crossbow rising, aiming. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but I was too far away, and my voice was lost in the general noise of camp. The crossbow loosed. I heard it, that distinctive twang, different from a bow, sharper and meaner. The bolt flew true. Everything slowed. I swear before God, I saw that bolt in flight, a black line cutting through the amber light. It struck Richard in the left shoulder, just where the neck meets the collarbone. The shield had been held low, useless. The bolt punched through the gambeson. I heard the wet, heavy sound of it, the sound meat makes when you drive a stake through it. Richard jerked in the saddle but did not fall. For a moment he sat very still, as if surprised. Then he reached up with his right hand and gripped the bolt's shaft. His horse, sensing something wrong, sidestepped nervously. The knights around him erupted into motion. Men were shouting, running. I found myself sprinting toward the king, my bow forgotten. By the time I reached the cluster of men surrounding Richard, he had dismounted. He was standing by God, with a crossbow bolt jutting from his shoulder, and he was walking back toward the camp. His face was pale but composed. He waved away the hands trying to support him. "It's nothing," I heard him say. "A scratch. The fool got lucky." But I saw blood, dark and wet, spreading across the cloth of his gambeson. I saw the way he held his left arm rigid, the way his jaw was clenched tight. It was not nothing. They took him to his tent, the great pavilion at the center of camp. I stood outside with the other common soldiers, waiting for word. The camp had gone silent, that terrible waiting silence of men who know something is very wrong, but do not yet know how wrong. Massadia stalked past, his face like carved stone, and disappeared into the royal tent. A priest hurried in, then another. Someone sent for the surgeon, a man named Mercedes, who traveled with the army. Night fell. Torches were lit around the camp, casting dancing shadows. I sat by my fire with the other archers, and we spoke in low voices, the way men do when they are afraid. "It's just a shoulder wound," someone said. "The king will be fine. He survived worse." "Remember Acre," another man offered. "He took a bolt to the side at Jaffa and fought on for 3 days." But I remembered the sound of that bolt striking flesh, and I said nothing. Sometime after midnight, a scream cut through the darkness. It came from the royal tent, a sound of agony so profound it silenced every conversation in camp. Then another scream, and another. The surgeon was working. I had seen battlefield surgery before. I knew what it meant, the probing for the bolt's head, the cutting of flesh, the terrible pulling and twisting as the surgeon tried to extract iron from meat without killing his patient. They were cutting the king without poppy, without mercy, only wine to dull the edge of pain. When the screaming finally stopped, I did not know if it meant success or death. We waited. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to grey to pale gold. The birds began to sing, indifferent to human suffering. A servant emerged from the tent and walked to the stream to wash cloths stained with blood. He would not meet our eyes. Then, around the 3rd hour, word came. The bolt was out. The king lived. He was even joking, they said, making light of his wound. He had called for wine and food. The camp exhaled. Men returned to their duties. The siege went on. But I had heard those screams in the night. I had seen the amount of blood on those cloths. And I knew, the way a soldier knows things in his bones, that something had gone very wrong in that tent. The worst was yet to come, though I did not know it then. I thought the danger had passed. I thought Richard, being Richard, would heal as he always healed, would rise again invincible and golden. I was wrong. The castle still stood before us, its stones indifferent to the drama playing out at its feet. The man with the frying pan had disappeared from the battlements. Somewhere inside those walls, he waited, not knowing that he had killed a king, not yet, but soon. The bolt was out, but death had already entered the wound, invisible and patient. It would take 10 days to finish what the crossbowman had begun. But I am ahead of myself. That first day, the 26th of March, ended with the king alive and the siege continuing. We thought the worst was over. We thought God would not take Richard Lionheart from us for such a small thing, such a chance wound. We were wrong. God's ways are not our ways, and death comes for kings as surely as it comes for common men. The darkness was already spreading, hidden beneath bandages, and none of us knew. The bolt struck with a sound I will never forget. Not the crack of impact you might imagine, but something softer, almost wet. A sound like a butcher's cleaver finding flesh. Richard made no cry. That is what I remember most clearly. The greatest warrior in Christendom struck down, and he made no sound at all. Just a sharp exhale, quick and controlled, as if he'd been punched in practice. His shield arm dropped slightly. For a heartbeat, one single suspended moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then chaos. Men rushed forward from all directions, shouting, stumbling over siege equipment, and each other in their haste to reach the king. I stood frozen, my own bow forgotten in my hands, watching as Mercadier reached Richard first. The mercenary captain's face had gone white as chalk beneath the dirt and stubble. Richard was still mounted, still upright, one hand now pressed to his left shoulder where the bolt protruded, dark against his gambeson. The fletching was crude. I could see even from where I stood. Common goose feathers, not the careful work of a master fletcher. An ordinary bolt. Nothing special. Nothing worthy of legend. And yet, I see it still, as clear as if I stand there now. The amber light of that March dusk. The mud churned by hundreds of feet. The small castle on its hill that should have fallen in a day. Richard's face in profile, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed not in pain, but in what looked almost like surprise, as if some part of him truly had believed he could not be touched. They got him down from the horse, carefully, quickly, Mercadier on one side and a knight named Robert on the other. Richard walked. That detail matters. He walked to his tent, refusing to be carried, though I could see the stiffness in his gait, the way he held his left arm tight against his body. "A scratch," I heard him say, loud enough for nearby men to hear. "I've had worse from sparring." But his voice was tight, controlled in a way that told those of us who knew battle wounds that the pain was worse than he let on. The camp erupted into activity. Surgeons were summoned. Mercadius arrived within minutes, sweating and anxious, carrying his leather case of instruments. Priests came too, moving through the gathering crowd of soldiers with their robes swishing, their faces grave. Someone sent riders, fast horses pounding away into the gathering darkness, carrying news that would change kingdoms. I found myself standing with a group of other archers, none of us quite knowing what to do. We had been about to loose our evening volley at the walls when the bolt struck. Our arrows remained knocked, useless now. "Did you see who fired it?" someone asked. "The man with the pan," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant. The one who'd been up there all afternoon mocking us. We had all seen him, that lone figure on the battlements, deflecting our arrows and the crossbow bolts of the Genoese mercenaries with what appeared to be a common frying pan. It had seemed almost comic earlier, this defender's impudent courage. We'd laughed about it, wagers flying about how long he'd last before a bolt found the gap between pan and parapet. Now the laughter felt obscene in my memory. The siege did not stop. That is another thing people forget, or perhaps never knew. A king struck down, possibly dying, and the engines of war ground on regardless. Mercadier came out of the royal tent, his face like carved stone, and gave orders in a voice that brooked no argument. The mining would continue, the assault would proceed, Châlus would fall, and every soul within would pay. I understood then that if Richard died, there would be no mercy, none at all. Night fell, and with it came the rumors. The camp had always been full of talk. Soldiers are worse than washerwomen for gossip. But that night, it reached a fever pitch. I heard a dozen different stories about the crossbowman. He was a knight, they said, one of Imer's household, a man of noble birth defending his lord's castle. No, he was a peasant, a mere commoner, who'd gotten lucky. No, he was a boy. Just a boy, some said, seeking revenge for his father and brothers whom Richard had killed in earlier campaigns. His name was Pierre, or Bertrand, or Dudo. Every man who claimed to know the truth told a different tale. I slept little that night. None of us did. We lay in our shelters listening to the sounds from the royal tent, low voices, the clink of instruments. At one point, what might have been a quickly stifled groan. Torchlight flickered behind the canvas walls. Shadows moved back and forth. Priests chanted, and we waited. By morning, the word spread that Richard would live. The surgeon had extracted the bolt, or so they told us. The king had endured the surgery without crying out, had even joked with Mercier afterward. He was Richard Lionheart. He had survived the Holy Land, survived wars without number, survived fevers and dysentery and blades that should have killed lesser men. Of course he would survive this. I wanted to believe it. God knows I wanted to believe it. But I had seen enough of wounds to know that the first day means nothing. It is the days after that kill you, when the flesh turns foul, when fever sets in, when the corruption spreads through the blood like poison. The siege continued. We went through the motions of our daily routine: morning muster, archery practice, work on the siege lines, evening muster, the distribution of rations. But everything felt hollow now, mechanical. We were going through familiar movements while waiting for news that might shatter the world we knew. The mining teams worked in shifts, tunneling beneath the castle's eastern wall. You could hear the picks and shovels even from the outer edges of camp, a constant rhythmic striking that went on day and night. They were racing against time now, trying to bring down Châlus before whatever was going to happen. On the second day, Richard was said to be doing well. He had taken bread and wine, had discussed strategy with his captains, had sent messages to his justiciar in England. "See," men said to each other. "See, the king is well." It was nothing, but on the third day, I smelled it. I was walking past the royal compound, closer than common archers usually came, but the camp layout had grown confused with all the coming and going, and the wind shifted just for a moment, and I caught it. Sweet. Sickly sweet, with an underlying rot that made my stomach turn. I knew that smell. Every man who had served in campaigns knew that smell. It was the smell of flesh going bad, of wounds turning gangrenous, of death. I saw it in other men's faces too, those who had been near enough to catch that drift of foul air. We did not speak of it. What was there to say? But we knew. The mood in camp changed. Priests became more numerous. Mercedier's face grew harder, more closed. The work on the mines intensified. There was a desperation to it now, a need to bring down these walls, to achieve something before the end came. Men drank more heavily at night. Fights broke out over nothing. A Brabançon mercenary stabbed a Norman knight in an argument about dice. 2 archers from Lincoln nearly killed each other over whose fault it was that what? That the king was dying. No one said it, but it hung over us like smoke. On the 4th or 5th day, I lose track now. The days blur together in memory. A rider came in at a gallop, his horse lathered and stumbling with exhaustion. I was near enough to the main track to see him dismount, to see how quickly he was ushered toward the royal tent. "Who is it?" someone asked. "Don't know," another man answered. "Scout, maybe? Message from John?" But it wasn't a scout. By evening, we knew. Queen Eleanor was coming, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The very name carried weight. She was a legend unto herself, older than anyone I knew, a woman who had been queen to 2 kings, mother to 3 more, who had led her own troops and survived her own husband's imprisonment. She had outlived most of her children already. Now she was riding to watch another son die. The work on the mines reached completion on what I think was the 7th day. I heard the props being set, smelled the pig fat and pitch they used to grease the timbers. At sunset, they lit it. We stood watching as smoke began to pour from the tunnel mouth as the fire took hold underground, burning away the wooden supports that held up tons of stone and earth. It would take hours for the wall to fall. We waited. Richard was dying. Everyone knew it now, though still no official word came from the royal tent. But you could see it in how the knights moved. hear it in the priest's constant prayers, smell it in that sweet, sick odor that now pervaded the entire royal compound, despite the incense they burned to mask it. The greatest warrior in Christendom was being consumed from within by corruption, killed not by a glorious battle or a mighty siege, but by infection from a petty wound at a nothing castle. And then she arrived. I was on watch at the perimeter when the outriders came in, and I saw her pass. Eleanor of Aquitaine was tiny. I had not expected that. Tiny and ancient, wrapped in black traveling clothes that were mud-splattered from hard riding. Her face was like carved ivory, all sharp bones and fierce eyes. She rode past me, perhaps 10 feet away, and I will swear to my dying day that I felt something. Some force of will, some terrible strength that surrounded her like an aura. Mercadier himself came out to greet her, and I saw that hard man bow his head like a penitent child. The entire camp fell silent as she passed. Even the hammers on the smithy stopped. Men removed their caps. Mercenaries who feared neither God nor devil stepped back to let her through. She went into the tent and did not come out. The wall fell in the night, a great roaring crash that woke the whole camp, followed by shouts and the clash of arms as our men poured through the breach. It was over in perhaps an hour. Châlus-Chabrol had fewer than 40 defenders, and they were exhausted from the siege, half-starved, facing hundreds of hardened troops who had been waiting days for this moment. They never had a chance. By dawn, prisoners were being dragged before the royal tent, what was left of the garrison, perhaps 15 or 20 men who had survived the assault. Among them was the crossbowman. They had bound his hands behind his back, and he was bleeding from a cut on his head, but he walked upright. Someone said his name was Pierre Basile. Someone else said Bertrand. I heard both. I was near enough to see when they brought him before the tent. I should not have been. Common archers had no business there. But in the chaos of the castle's fall, the usual strict boundaries of rank had dissolved. I stood among a crowd of soldiers and knights and mercenaries, all of us waiting to see what would happen to the man who had killed the king. Except Richard was not yet dead. They brought Basile into the tent. I could not see what happened inside, but I heard it. Men who were inside told the story later, and it spread through the camp like wildfire. Richard was conscious, wasted, grey-skinned, the wound in his shoulder now a suppurating mass of blackened flesh, but conscious. They brought the crossbowman before him, this man who had fired the fatal shot. What did Richard feel in that moment? Anger, hatred, fear? I will never know. But what he said. "Young man," the king asked, his voice weak but clear, "what have I done to you that you should kill me?" Basile answered. Different men reported different words, but the essence was the same. He spoke of Richard's wars, of people killed, perhaps of his own family destroyed, or perhaps he simply said he was defending his lord's castle, doing his duty. The stories vary, but Richard's response, that is remembered clearly by all who heard it. "I forgive you my death," the king said. "Live on, and by my bounty, behold the light of day." He ordered 100 shillings given to Basile, and commanded that the man be freed, unharmed. I heard this, and felt something break in my chest. Here was Richard in his true nature, not the warrior who had killed thousands, not the king who had taxed his subjects into poverty to fund his wars, but the lion-hearted man who could forgive his own murderer. It was kingly. It was Christian. It was everything the song said he should be. That was late morning, perhaps early afternoon of the 6th of April. The day was overcast, I remember, with a thin cold rain that turned the camp to deeper mud. We stood about in small groups, no one quite knowing what to do. The siege was over, the castle had fallen, the prisoners were taken, and now we simply waited for the end. It came at evening. The light was failing when a great cry went up from the royal tent. Not of pain, but of grief, the sound of a woman's anguish cutting through the dusk like a blade. We knew. We all knew. Men sank to their knees. Some wept openly. Others stood stunned, unable to process what had happened. Richard Lionheart was dead. I stood there in the mud, my bow hanging loose in my hand, and I felt the world shift beneath my feet. Everything I had known, everything I had fought for, gone in a moment. Richard had been the center, the fixed point around which everything else moved, and now he was gone, and we were adrift. The bells should have rung. In a proper kingdom, in a proper city, bells would have tolled for the death of a king. But we were in a muddy field before a fallen castle in Limousin, and there were no bells, just the rain, and the gathering darkness, and the sound of men weeping for a king who would never rise again. I learned later what happened to Pierre Basile. Richard's final command, his kingly mercy, it meant nothing once the king was dead. Mercadier took the crossbowman and had him flayed alive. They stripped the skin from his body while he still lived, then hanged what remained. So much for forgiveness, so much for mercy. The moment Richard died, his will became meaningless, and the old brutal law of vengeance reasserted itself. That is what I remember of the death of Richard Lionheart. Not the glory, not the legend, but the reality. A good man with a frying pan and a crossbow, a king too proud to wear his armor, a wound that should not have killed, and 10 days of watching greatness die by inches, consumed by rot and corruption. And at the end, an act of forgiveness that was betrayed before the king's body was even cold. I am old now, and I have seen much, but I have never seen anything that shook me as deeply as those days at Châlus. We thought Richard was invincible. We thought he would live forever. We were wrong. For 3 days after the bolt struck, we dared to hope. Richard joked about the wound, called it a scratch, demanded wine and meat as if nothing had changed. The surgeon Machadius had cut the bolt from his shoulder. I heard it took nearly an hour, the king's jaw clenched tight, refusing to cry out, while the man dug and probed with iron tools slick with blood. They said Richard made light of it afterward, asked if the crossbowman was still on the walls, wondered aloud if the man's aim might improve with practice. But I saw the bandages when they carried them from the tent, saw how much blood there was, dark and thick, soaking through layer after layer of linen. Still, he was Richard. He had survived worse, or so we told ourselves. At Jaffa, he'd fought Saladin's army with fever burning through him. At Acre, he'd commanded the siege while racked with illness that killed lesser men. A crossbow bolt to the shoulder. The king would shake it off like rainwater. On the 4th day, the smell began. I was drawing water from the stream when the wind shifted, carrying with it something sweet and foul at once. The smell every soldier knows, the smell of flesh going bad. I looked toward the royal tent, its canvas stirring in the April breeze, and my hands went cold despite the bucket's weight. The surgeon emerged moments later, walking quickly, his face pale as chalk. He said nothing to the guards, nothing to the knights who pressed him with questions. He simply walked to the far edge of camp and vomited into the bushes. That night, the whispers started. Gangrene, mortification of the flesh. The wound had turned foul. God was calling the king home. I wanted to disbelieve it, wanted to rage against the unfairness. Richard, who had survived crusade and war, brought down by a lucky shot from a petty castle's walls. But I had seen too many wounds turn black, too many strong men reduced to fevered shadows. The sweet rot smell told the truth our hearts refused to accept. The days that followed blurred together like rain smearing ink. We continued the siege. What else could we do? The miners dug their tunnels, the sappers set their fires, and the castle walls groaned under the assault. But the heart had gone out of it. Men went through the motions with dead eyes, glancing constantly toward the royal tent, where death was winning its own siege. I remember the morning a rider came thundering into camp, his horse lathered white with foam. He carried word that Queen Eleanor was coming, the king's mother, traveling at a pace that would have killed a woman half her age. She was 77 years old, had been Queen of France and England, had raised armies and survived imprisonment, and now she raced through the spring mud to reach her dying son. The camp transformed when Eleanor arrived on the 3rd of April. I had never seen her before. Common archers did not move in royal circles. But I watched her pass, this tiny woman in black traveling clothes, mud splattered from hard riding, her face carved from stone and grief. The hardest mercenaries bowed their heads. Mercadier himself, that brutal captain who feared nothing living, stood silent as she swept past him without a glance. She was not a queen at that moment. She was a mother rushing toward her child's deathbed, and something in that universal sorrow commanded respect, even from men who respected nothing. The fire burns low, and my old bones grow cold. There are other tales in these scars, stories of kings, of crusades, and of the quiet moments between the storms. But those are tales for another night. Rest now, the history remains.